Hello, Internet. Welcome back to On My Shelf, which is the series that we're doing video follow-ups to our current sermon series. So the series that we're doing right now is on prayer, and we're doing the Summer of Prayer emphasis where we look at how prayer helps us connect with God. That was last month. This month, we're looking at how prayer helps us grow. And next month, we're going to look at how we serve God and our community through prayer. And this week, yesterday, the sermon was on meditation and how we, biblical meditation, and how we use scripture and we incorporate it into our prayer lives. And what I really wanted to emphasize was the fact that we need to take scripture and apply it to ourselves individually. And that the way we grow and the way we hear from God is by taking scripture and asking, what does this mean to me? And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk to you about one book on my shelf that's actually connected to lots of books on my shelf that helped me to formulate this idea, and it helped me to develop this practice in my life. And this journey begins for me with this author, not this book, but this book just has a really good picture of him on the front. This is Soren Kierkegaard. Soren Kierkegaard is a Danish theologian. He lived in Denmark in the early to mid 1800s. And he wrote lots of books. These two stacks are about half of his published works, I think is what I ended up with by the time I was done collecting them. These are half. He wrote a ton, just a ridiculous amount. But he is most famous for this book. And this is the first Kierkegaard book I ever bought. And it used to be white. I don't know how well you can see that it has gotten quite dirty through use. But this book is his most famous book. It's very little, but it's incredibly dense. This book is called Fear and Trembling. Now, this is a book that would be it can be very difficult to read for two reasons. One is because it was translated from Danish, and I'm not sure that the sentence structure and the word choice translates very well. I've read a couple of different translations of this book, and it's a difficult translation to make. The other is it's highly philosophical. Excuse me. It's highly philosophical and technical, and so it requires a lot of context. So it's slow going, is what I'm saying. It's a small book. You'll need to take it sentence by sentence and possibly with a dictionary. One of the main ideas in here is the teleological suspension of the ethical, which is not language that we use every day. I don't know that this is necessarily a book for everyone, but it was a book that I really needed and that I encountered in college when I first read about Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard, for me, when I went into college, I was really interested in philosophy. And Kierkegaard is taught in a lot of philosophy classes, but primarily he's a theologian. He was trained in theology, and that's how he thought of himself. And so Kierkegaard was kind of a bridge for me from philosophy to theology and to really thinking critically about Christianity. For whatever reason, for a long time, I had this idea that people who talked about their faith a lot, that just wasn't intelligent. I don't know. I guess I didn't really have much experience with really thoughtful, philosophical Christians for whatever reason, because now I know that's completely absurd. But Kierkegaard was that bridge for me. And it also just so happens that the book Fear and Trembling is a fantastic example of meditation, which is what we talked about yesterday. And so what I want to do is I want to just explain to you what this book is about and the way it challenges us, because there is a concept in this book that I know you've heard of. He coined a phrase that people use all the time, and even made it into an Indiana Jones film. So I'll give you that teaser to keep you interested. Fear and Trembling. The basic premise is that it is written in the voice of a character named Johannes Climacus. And Johannes, what he does is he takes the story of the binding of Isaac and he meditates on it throughout the book. And he uses several of the techniques we talked about. I'm sorry, not Climacus. It was Johannes de Silentio. So what Kierkegaard does is he writes like all of these books and these two, or this one, are written in characters. Like the authors are other characters. He's not writing his name. It's kind of like writing a play. And so this one is written as a guy named Johannes de Silentio. And he writes about the story of the binding of Isaac. If you don't know what that is right off the bat, the binding of Isaac is the story of when God speaks to Abraham and he tells Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, which is a huge deal for two reasons. Number one, human sacrifice is bad, and it always is. Throughout Scripture, human sacrifice is always bad. In fact, it's one of the worst things. It's like if your culture is sacrificing humans, that's proof that you are completely away from God. That's how it's usually perceived. And two, the other problem with this is that Isaac was a miracle baby that God gave to Abraham. In fact, Abraham's entire story up to that chapter, we're in Genesis 21, has been believing that God would give him this son, even though he's 100 years old, and then he would be able to create this big family that would become the Israelites. So not only is God telling him to do something wrong, but he is telling him to do something that effectively cuts off the entire family line that God has promised Abraham. God told Abraham, I'll make you many nations. And if Isaac dies, then the whole promise dies. And that is a really challenging chapter for a lot of people. It's one of those chapters, like we talked about yesterday, it's one of those passages that sticks in your brain and you chew on it and you chew on it and you chew on it. And because there isn't an easy explanation for what's going on here, because God tells him to do something morally wrong. And so is it a good thing that Abraham is willing to do it? These are the kind of questions that meditation will bring up. Should we really be glad that Abraham was willing to do that? Like when God said, hey, sacrifice your son, shouldn't Abraham have said, no, that's wrong? And how can we root for the guy who's going to kill his own son? And why would God tell him to do something and then tell him not to? And what if God hadn't stopped? It provokes all of these different questions. And so Johannes de Silentio just leans into all of those questions. Well, the really philosophical versions that people in his day were coming up with. And so he does a couple of interesting things. The sections, he doesn't have chapters, the sections are weirdly titled. One of the first sections is called Attunement. And what he basically does is he retells the story, the biblical story, in 4 different ways. And he makes little changes to the story, the way that, and it's kind of the emotional journey of Abraham. He tells it from Abraham's perspective, and each time there's something, he tries to explain what's going on in a different way to make it so that Abraham didn't. He's trying to get into Abraham's head and try and explain how Abraham would be willing to do this, and none of the explanations are good, and none of them really make sense. But he's imagining this story and what it must have been like to be Abraham, and that's part of chewing on Scripture, imagining it, experiencing it. It's easy to read the story of this story and very technically, but you don't really get it unless you emotionally engage with the spot that Abraham is in. And so then there's this speech in praise of Abraham that talks about how Abraham is the father of faith, and that's how we see him. He is this very important person who shows us what faith is like. And that story is held up as the proof of what faith means. And he continues to imagine what it must have been like for Abraham and how dramatic this was. And so recognizing that Abraham is this example that we're supposed to follow, that prompts him to ask 3 questions. We call them problemata. Again, very technical, weird lingo. But basically, here's the first question he asks. Let me get to it. Problemata 1. Is there a teleological suspension of the ethical? Here's what that means in normal language. Ethical rules, moral rules are absolute. They're right and they're wrong. And so that's what they are all the time. Wrong is always wrong and right is always right. And if you've got something that is sometimes right and sometimes wrong, then that means there's a deeper level to go till you find the thing that's always right. And this is how we normally view things. So murdering your child, wrong. Human sacrifice, wrong. Bad, don't do it. Okay? And the question then is, are there times when we have to put morality to the side for the sake of something more important, where we suspend right and wrong for the purpose of some bigger thing? Teleological means focusing towards a bigger end. And so is there a time when we put aside right and wrong to accomplish something more important, or because we are looking for something more important? And we would say no, right? Instantly we would say no. You never put aside right and wrong. That's what unethical people do. That's what bad people do. That's what corrupt people do. And yet, that's also what Abraham does. Because Abraham knows murdering children, bad. Murdering your kid, bad. Sacrificing human beings, bad. He knows this. And yet, he also knows for a fact that God himself has commanded him to do this. This isn't some vague idea, like I get this feeling like maybe God is leading me to sacrifice my son. No, God spoke to him, said, take this son whom you love and offer him as a sacrifice. So he knows that God is telling him to do something. The question is, can you then set aside right and wrong in order to obey God? And he says, or in order to do something more important, he says there has to be. That must be what Abraham is doing. I apologize. I'm going to butcher some of this because it's been a while since I did Kierkegaard. As you can tell, Kierkegaard has been very, very important to me and very formative to me. I put all these books up not to brag or anything, because that's not an impressive thing, but just to show how formative this guy has been to me and how much I was challenged by his thinking. And he really forced me to think about what it means to have faith, because ultimately that's what this book is about. See, and the second problemata, the second question is there an absolute duty to God? And he says, yes, there is. In fact, the reason why here's the question, that the common philosophical question that will get thrown around. Is it right because God said to do it, or did God say to do it because it's right? That is, does God decide right and wrong, or is right and wrong higher than God? And what he's saying is that we have a duty to obey God that is bigger than right and wrong. And the reason why we are obligated to do right is because God has told us to. It's an interesting challenge. And then let me cut through all the philosophy, which I love and I think is really interesting and really important. And let me get to the idea that is most useful in this book. What he does is he meditates on what it must have been like for Abraham, and he gets to this point. He thinks if you take the story seriously, you always end up at this point, that Abraham had 2 contradicting commands or principles. He must obey God, and it's wrong to murder children. Okay? And what do you do with those two things? They are an absolute paradox. And you reach a point where you can't think your way out of it. There is no place where you can just where you can avoid making a choice because you can't just reason your way out of it. Those two things contradict each other. When God says kill your son and morality says don't kill your son. And so what you have to do is you have to make a choice. Ultimately, it comes down to you. No one can make the choice for you. No one can give you permission. No one can take the blame for you. You have to decide, which one am I going to do? And that is faith. Faith is, and here's the important thing that this book helps us understand, because this is the book from which we get the phrase leap of faith, which is one of the trials in the third Indiana Jones movie. The leap of faith. We often think that it means, okay, I have no reason to believe that things will go this way, but I'm just going to leap. I'm just going to trust that it'll happen. I'm going to ignore all the evidence against it and just going to do it. That's not faith, according to Kierkegaard. According to Kierkegaard, faith is when you have seen the reasons for both sides and you ultimately have to make a decision. This is not when, there's no reason to think that things are going to turn out for me, but I'm just going to have blind faith that it will. Okay, that's when you have, like, the evidence is lopsided, but you just decide you want to disagree with the evidence. That's not what he's talking about. There are times when we have to make choices, and we have to decide to live in one of them, and that's faith. That's the leap of faith, to say, I'm going to trust in God. That even though my conscience and societal norms and everything the world is telling me about right and wrong says that this thing is wrong, I'm going to trust God. And I'm going to follow him and commit to what he's telling me to do. That's the leap of faith. And it's something that every one of us has to do as an individual. Because ultimately, you cannot think your way into believing that Jesus is Lord. And you cannot simply think your way into being a Christian. And this is, we might say, is the limitation of arguing people into the gospel, right? That there is a ton of evidence. There's a ton of evidence. I would argue all the reliable evidence points to Scripture being true and Jesus being God and Jesus having been crucified and risen from the dead. But ultimately, the evidence will not make the decision for you. And there are a lot of people who can't argue with the evidence, but still won't make the commitment to Jesus. And there are people who struggle with the evidence, who struggle to believe the evidence, but they're still committed to Jesus. Because you can pile up all the evidence, all the books, all the learning, everything that everybody tells you. You can pile it all up, but it won't make the decision for you. And just like Abraham, you have to make a commitment. You have to decide. Who are you going to trust? Who are you going to follow? What are you going to do? That is the leap of faith. And that is a huge part of Soren Kierkegaard's writings, because ultimately, towards the end of his life, he became a radical, arguing against the state church in Denmark. And his problem with the government's religion was that you were a Christian just because you've been born in Denmark. Like the church was just a wing of the Danish government. And so the way they kept birth records was through baby baptisms. And the way they kept, the marriage certificates and the death certificate and all of that, that was all done through the church. So you were a Christian simply because you've been born in Denmark. And he's saying, no, that's not how faith works. That's not what it means to be a Christian. What it means to be a Christian is to decide as an individual to follow Jesus. And if we want to connect that to the practices of our churches, that's one of the big reasons why we believe in believers' baptism, is because baptism is a choice that you can't make as a baby. You make it as when you are capable of making that leap of faith and making that commitment. And so all of these ideas came out or are structured around reflecting on the story of Abraham and imagining, what would it be like if I was Abraham? What would that feel like? What would that look like? And in what ways are God In what ways is God calling me to be like Abraham now? Where do I have opportunities to make a leap of faith to God? Where are there places where I need to trust God and just make that step? For some of us, we have a hard time believing that if we, God will be there if we witness to our friends, or if we do the right thing when we're tempted to do the wrong thing, or when people are pressuring us to do the wrong thing. We struggle to believe that God really does stand up for us. God really does protect us. We struggle to believe that God is right when he says that we ought to give to others, that we ought to be generous, that if we are generous, he will take care of us. We struggle to believe a lot of the things that God says, and so we don't do them. And so as you reflect on that story, you're kind of challenged to be like Abraham and to be willing to commit to obeying God, even though you don't know how God's going to make it all work. You don't know how God's going to get you through. I could go on and on about, this is just one of his books. Like I said, I love Kierkegaard, and it's been too long since I've read his works. But hopefully that's helpful to you and gives you a good example of how you can think through a story in the Bible and be challenged by it. And the truth is that I'm sure if you read that story and if you talk about it, you will find more and more to talk about, like to try and make sense of that story, because it just sticks in your craw, and there's just so much stuff to chew on there. So I encourage you to read that story. Like I said, I think it's in Genesis 20 or 21. Read it and chew on it and let it bug you, and find someone else who will read it and talk with them about it and meditate on it. Next week, we are going to be talking about adoration. And the book that we're going to be doing, we're going to be doing a very interesting book called God is Not. And it's about all of the things that we say about God that aren't, well, not all, but some of the things that we say about God that are not true. It's a very intriguing little book that I found very interesting, and we'll be talking about that next week. So hopefully you'll join in with us then. If you're local, we'd love to see you at Turner Christian Church. If not, we'd love to see you here next week. Thanks so much.